There is a place in Ontario called Kelly's Cove. It is a quiet stretch of shoreline near Georgian Bay, and on a summer afternoon, it looks like every other beautiful Canadian lake view you have ever seen. The water is clear. The pines are thick. The rock shelves slope gently down into the shallows, and if you sit long enough, you can hear loons calling across the water. But if you crouch down and press your hand flat against those rock shelves, you will feel something. Long parallel grooves cut deep into the stone. Smooth channels running in the same direction, like something enormous dragged itself across the bedrock and left its fingerprints behind. Some of those grooves are 1/2 meter wide. Some of them run for hundreds of meters without stopping. They are so clean and precise that if you did not know better, you might think a machine had made them. Something with perfect mechanical regularity. Something impossibly large. What made those grooves was not a machine. It was ice. Ice that was, in places, nearly 4 kilometers thick. Ice that covered every single square kilometer of what we now call Canada. Ice so heavy that it pressed the land itself downward into the mantle of the earth, bending the continent like a loaded shelf. Ice that moved slowly and with unimaginable force, grinding everything beneath it, polishing mountains into gentle domes, carving valleys 1,000 meters deep, dragging boulders the size of houses across hundreds of kilometers, and then simply dropping them in the middle of fields where they still sit today, inexplicable and alone. Canada, as we know it, was made by ice. The lakes, the valleys, the prairies, the coastlines, the soil that feeds the wheat fields, the river channels that carry meltwater to the sea, all of it. Every feature of this landscape carries the signature of what happened here between approximately 26,000 and 10,000 years ago, during a period we call the last glacial maximum and its long grinding aftermath. But here is the question that most people never stop to ask. Not just what did the ice do to Canada, but what was Canada like when the ice was here? What lived at the edges of those glaciers? What sounds filled the air in a landscape that no human being alive today has ever seen? What walked across the frozen ground north of where the ice ended? What swam in the lakes that formed at the glacier's edge? And what did the first people who entered this land see when they arrived? What world were they walking into? That is what we are going to talk about tonight. We are going to go back, further back than the founding of Confederation, further back than any European contact, further back than the oldest First Nations oral traditions can clearly reach. We are going to go back to a Canada that was almost unrecognizable, a Canada of mammoths and saber-toothed cats and giant beavers the size of black bears, a Canada of a single ice sheet so vast it affected the climate of the entire planet, a Canada that was, in certain places, louder and stranger and more alive than anything that exists here now. And then we are going to watch it end. We are going to follow the melt, the floods, the extinctions, and the slow, patient return of life to a landscape that the ice had scraped clean. If you're settling in for the night, get comfortable. If you have a blanket nearby, pull it over you. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of content you find yourself coming back to, the kind of deep, slow documentary that takes you somewhere else entirely, then consider subscribing. It helps more than you might think. And if you have a moment, leave a comment somewhere in this video. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if there's a particular era of Canadian history you would like to explore. I read every single one. Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the ice, but the beginning of the world that the ice would eventually cover. Because before we can understand what Canada was like during the Ice Age, we need to understand what Canada was like before it. And the answer to that question is warmer than you might expect. Approximately 3 million years ago, a period geologists call the Pliocene, the average temperature of the Earth was roughly 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, warmer than it is today. That does not sound like much, but 2 to 3 degrees is the difference between a world with ice sheets and a world without them. It is the difference between sea levels today and sea levels 20 meters higher. In the Pliocene, the Arctic was not frozen tundra, it was boreal forest. Larch trees grew within a few hundred kilometers of the North Pole. The waters of the Arctic Ocean were ice-free in summer. What is now permafrost in the Northwest Territories was soft, wet, productive ground that supported rich ecosystems of plants and animals that look almost familiar, almost like what you might see in Canada today, except slightly larger, slightly stranger, like a version of the world turned up by a degree of wildness that has since been dialed back. Then, somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, the Earth began to cool. Slowly at first, and then in a pattern that scientists are still working to fully understand, the planet began to cycle in and out of ice ages. These were not gradual, linear descents into cold. They were oscillations, pulses of glaciation separated by warmer interglacials that sometimes lasted thousands of years. The cause of these cycles involves the geometry of Earth's orbit around the sun, the tilt of the planet's axis, the distribution of continents, ocean circulation patterns, and the chemistry of the atmosphere. It involves feedback loops so complex and interlocking that even now, with satellite data and supercomputers and ice cores drilled from the Antarctic plateau, the details are still being worked out. What is clear is this: over the last roughly 2 million years, ice has advanced and retreated across North America dozens of times. Each glaciation left its mark. Each retreat revealed a landscape that had been scoured and reshaped. And the most recent of these glaciations, the one we call the Wisconsin glaciation, peaked approximately 21,000 years ago in what geologists call the last glacial maximum. That is the moment we are going to spend most of our time in tonight. The moment when the ice was at its greatest extent, when Canada was, in the most literal sense, a different world. But to understand the last glacial maximum, you need to understand what came before it. Because the Wisconsin glaciation did not begin all at once. It began gradually, incrementally, over tens of thousands of years, as snow that fell each winter failed to fully melt each summer, and the snowpack deepened year after year, century after century, until its own weight compressed it into ice, and the ice began to flow. The process that builds an ice sheet is almost meditative in its patience. In the highlands of what is now Labrador, and separately in the highlands of what is now Kiewit, in the Northwest Territories, snow accumulated and compacted and became firn, which is the halfway state between loose snow and solid glacial ice. Firn is dense and granular, and as more snow piles on top of it, it slowly, over years and decades, becomes true glacial ice. Glacial ice is a metamorphic rock. It has a crystalline structure. Under sufficient pressure, it flows, not like water, but like extremely slow putty, deforming plastically, moving outward and downward from its center of accumulation. A single ice crystal does not flow, but the aggregate behavior of billions of them does. In Labrador and Keewatin, two separate ice domes formed, and over thousands of years they grew and merged into what geologists call the Laurentide ice sheet. This would become the defining feature of Canada during the Ice Age. And when we talk about the Laurentide ice sheet, we need to be careful to convey its scale, because the numbers alone are inadequate. The Laurentide ice sheet at its maximum covered approximately 13 million square kilometers. That is larger than the continent of Antarctica. It stretched from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast. It reached south into what is now Illinois and Ohio and New York. It buried the entire area of modern Canada east of the Cordilleran Mountains under a continuous blanket of ice that was, at its thickest points, over 3.5 kilometers deep. 3.5 kilometers. That is taller than many of the peaks in the Canadian Rockies. If you had been standing at the center of the Laurentide ice sheet at the last glacial maximum and looked in any direction, you would have seen nothing but white. Nothing but the gradual curve of an ice plain stretching to every horizon under a sky that would have been intensely, blindingly bright with reflected sunlight. No mountain would have been visible because the mountains were buried. No river valley because the valleys were filled. No lake because the lakes were under ice or had not yet been carved. Just an unbroken white surface, wind sculpted into ridges and hollows, under a sky so cold and so clear that the stars at night would have been extraordinary. The weight of this ice did something that is difficult to fully grasp. It pressed the continent down. The lithosphere, which is the rigid outer layer of the earth, is not infinitely stiff. Under sufficient weight, sustained over sufficient time, it deforms. The Laurentide ice sheet was so heavy that it depressed the land beneath it by as much as 900 meters in some areas. The crust of the earth bent downward under the weight of the ice, and this is not ancient, finished history. Canada is still rebounding from that depression. Right now, as you listen to this, the land around Hudson Bay is rising at approximately 1 centimeter per year, still recovering from a weight that was removed 10,000 years ago. Parts of Ontario and Quebec are higher above sea level than they were a century ago. The continent is still exhaling. But the Laurentide ice sheet was not the only glacier in Canada during the last glacial maximum. To the west, in the mountain ranges of British Columbia and the Yukon, a separate system had developed. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the coast mountains, the interior ranges, and most of what is now British Columbia. Unlike the Laurentide, which was a continental sheet, a single vast dome of ice spreading outward in all directions, the Cordilleran was more complex, a mosaic of interconnected valley glaciers and ice fields, shaped and channeled by the mountain topography beneath it. Where the two ice sheets met, somewhere in the foothills of Alberta and in the Peace River country, they merged into a single, nearly continuous wall of ice stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That wall had edges, and the edges of the Laurentide ice sheet are where the story gets interesting, because at the edge of the glacier, life was happening. Complicated, rich, loud, violent, beautiful life. The periglacial zone, the area just beyond the limit of the ice, was not dead. It was, in many respects, among the most productive ecosystems that has ever existed in North America. To understand this, you need to know what the edge of a glacier actually looks like. It is not a clean wall. It is not a cliff of ice standing straight up from the ground. A glacier's edge is typically a complex, chaotic, rubble-strewn landscape. The ice at the margin is dirty, full of the rock and sediment it has been grinding and carrying for thousands of years. It melts and refreezes constantly. Meltwater streams emerge from the ice and spread across the outwash plain beyond, depositing the sediment they carry in sheets of gravel and sand. The ground immediately beyond the ice is cold, and the permafrost beneath it extends far beyond the glacier's edge, sometimes hundreds of kilometers into what appears to be ice-free ground. The soil is thin and rocky and wet, and the wind that blows off the glacier is constant and fierce. But that wind carried something. It carried silt. Glacial flour, the finest rock, dust ground by the ice from the bedrock below, caught the wind and traveled. This material, called loess, settled across the periglacial landscape in thick layers, and it was extraordinarily fertile. The loess deposits of the prairies, the ones that underlie the topsoil of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba, are glacial in origin. They are the pulverized remains of mountains and ancient seafloors carried by meltwater and wind and deposited across what was, at the last glacial maximum, a cold, dry, windswept plain that looked nothing like the prairie landscape of today. That plain was the Mammoth Steppe, and the Mammoth Steppe was one of the most extensive and biologically productive grassland ecosystems in the history of the planet. Let us spend some time here, because it deserves it. The Mammoth Steppe stretched from Western Europe across Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia to North America during the height of glaciation, and into what is now Alaska and the Yukon. It was a cold, dry grassland dominated by grasses, sedges, sagebrush, and low-growing forbs. It was the Ice Age version of the steppe, colder and more continental in climate than any grassland that exists today, but surprisingly productive. The permafrost beneath it locked away moisture, which meant the surface stayed relatively dry, and the vegetation, though low and wind-battered, was nutritionally rich. Ice Age grasses had high protein content. The sedges that grew in the wetter depressions were dense and productive. The Mammoth Steppe was, despite its harsh climate, a kind of buffet, a vast, continuous buffet of cold-adapted vegetation that could support enormous populations of grazing mammals. And the mammals that lived on the Mammoth Steppe were, in many cases, enormous. The woolly mammoth. Let us start there because it is the one everyone knows, the one whose image defines the Ice Age in the popular imagination. But the familiar image of the woolly mammoth, the shaggy elephant-like creature with the long curved tusks, barely does justice to what this animal actually was. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, was a close relative of the Asian elephant, but adapted for cold in ways that went far beyond a thick coat. Its ears were small to reduce heat loss. Its tail was short for the same reason. Its fat reserves were extraordinary, up to 9 centimeters of subcutaneous fat beneath the skin. Its blood had a special adaptation that allowed it to release oxygen to the tissues at temperatures that would incapacitate the hemoglobin of a modern elephant. Its wool, which covered an insulating layer of dense underfur, was up to 90 centimeters long on some parts of the body. The color varied from reddish-brown to nearly black, depending on the individual and perhaps the season. The tusks of a mature bull woolly mammoth could reach over 4 meters in length. 4 meters, longer than many cars. They were not just display weapons, though they served that function too. They were tools. Mammoths used their tusks to sweep snow off vegetation in winter, to dig through ice for water, to strip bark from trees, to push each other in dominance contests. The wear patterns preserved on fossil tusks tell an extraordinarily detailed story about how individual animals lived and what they ate and how old they were. One mammoth tusk found in Siberia showed evidence of seasonal growth rings, dietary changes, periods of stress, all recorded in the calcium and carbon isotopes locked into the tusk's layers like tree rings. In Canada, woolly mammoth remains have been found across a wide range of locations. In the Yukon and northern British Columbia, which were largely ice-free during the last glacial maximum, because the extreme cold and low snowfall of the far north, paradoxically, meant that not enough snow fell to build a thick ice sheet. In parts of what is now Alberta, in the periglacial zone just south of the Laurentide ice margin, and in river deposits across the prairies where the bones were carried by meltwater and buried in sediment as the glaciers retreated. One of the most remarkable mammoth finds in Canada came from near Dawson City in the Yukon, where the permafrost of the region has, over the decades of gold mining, yielded an extraordinary range of frozen ice age remains. The permafrost of the Yukon is a kind of natural deep freeze, preserving organic material across tens of thousands of years with a fidelity that is sometimes shocking. Skin, hair, gut contents, partially digested grass still identifiable in the stomach. The permafrost does not just preserve bones, it preserves the animal. In 2022, miners working at placer gold claim in the Klondike region of the Yukon exposed what turned out to be the remains of a young woolly mammoth calf. She was given the name Nun-cho-ga by the Trondek-Hwechin First Nation, which translates roughly as big baby animal. She was approximately 30 to 35 days old when she died, sometime between 30 and 35,000 years ago. Her skin was largely intact. Her hair was preserved. Her trunk was still present. The contents of her intestines were analyzable. She is one of the most complete woolly mammoth specimens ever discovered anywhere in the world, and she was found in Canada, in the Yukon, by people who were looking for gold. The Yukon, during the height of the Ice Age, was not covered by the Laurentide ice sheet. It was ice-free, and in that ice-free landscape Nuncho-ga walked. She drank from rivers, she ate grass. She followed her mother through a landscape that stretched, continuous and cold and alive, from what is now interior Alaska all the way across Siberia to Europe. She was part of a population that numbered in the millions, a population that had walked this land for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, somewhere in her first month of life, she died. The permafrost swallowed her, and she waited, perfectly preserved, for 30,000 years, until a machine digging through ancient gravel exposed her to the light. That is the kind of encounter that the Ice Age offers, if you know where to look. The mammoth was not alone on the mammoth steppe, not by a long way. The woolly rhinoceros, Culodonta antiquitatis, shared the Eurasian mammoth steppe, though its North American relatives were less directly related. The steppe bison, Bison priscus, a larger and heavier animal than the modern plains bison, roamed in enormous herds across the unglaciated areas of what is now Canada. Steppe bison remains have been found across the Yukon and throughout the prairies, and some of these remains are extraordinary. A frozen bison head discovered in Alaska in 1951, called Blue Babe due to the vivid mineral staining on its skin, retained enough soft tissue to reveal that this particular animal had been killed by a lion. Not just killed, but cached, covered by the predator for later feeding, then covered by the permafrost before the lion could return. The claw marks of the cat were still visible in the skin. There were horses in Ice Age Canada. This is one of the facts that tends to surprise people, because horses seem so European, so recently arrived on the North American continent. But horses evolved in North America. The modern horse, Equus caballus, originated here in the grasslands of North America and spread across the Bering Land Bridge to Eurasia. The horses that existed in Ice Age Canada were the ancestors of Eurasian horses, and they were present in large numbers. Their bones appear in deposits across the Yukon, Alberta, and the Prairie provinces. When the first Europeans arrived in the 16th century, bringing horses back to the Americas, those animals were returning to the continent of their origin. They were coming home. There were camels here too. North American camels of the genus Camelops lived across western North America during the last glacial maximum. They were taller than modern camels, more lightly built, with longer legs and a proportionally smaller hump. Their bones have been found in deposits that place them in the southern Yukon during the Ice Age, and across what is now the western United States and parts of Mexico. Like the horse, the camel evolved in North America and spread across Beringia to the rest of the world. The dromedaries of Arabia and the Bactrian camels of Central Asia are the descendants of animals that walked the same ground as the woolly mammoth in a Canada that no longer exists. The giant ground sloth, the short-faced bear, the American mastodon, a relative but not a direct ancestor of modern elephants, stockier and more forest adapted than the mammoth, with different teeth suited to browsing leaves and bark rather than grazing on grass. The American lion, Panthera atrox, which was significantly larger than the modern African lion and may have been the largest cat that has ever lived. The dire wolf, Canis dairus, heavier boned and more powerful than the modern gray wolf, adapted for taking down the large, slow prey that was abundant on the Ice Age plains. And the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, perhaps the most famous of all the Ice Age predators, and perhaps the most consistently misrepresented. Smilodon was not a sleek, jaguar-like animal with oversized fangs. It was massive, heavily muscled in the forelimbs and shoulders, with a neck like a wrestler and a body built for pinning struggling prey. Its famous canine teeth, which could reach 28 centimeters in length, were not for stabbing. They were for slicing. Smilodon would use its enormous forelimbs to pull down prey, pin it, and then deliver a precise bite to the throat or underbelly with those elongated canines, severing major blood vessels in a single, controlled motion. It was a precision killing machine in a body built like a wrestler. Smilodon remains are most commonly found in the tar pits of California, but the animal's range extended into Canada, at least into the periglacial zones of the south and west during warmer periods, whether it ventured as far north as the Yukon during the last glacial maximum is less clear, but the principal predator of the northern mammoth steppe was probably not Smilodon. It was a cat you might not have heard of. The American cave lion, Panthera atrox, which was not actually a cave lion in the same sense as its Eurasian cousin, but a distinct species that hunted the open plains. Fossil evidence suggests it was a cooperative hunter, a social ambush predator working in groups to take down prey that no single cat could handle alone. Into this world, sometime between 25,000 and 14,000 years ago, depending on which archaeological evidence you trust and which route you believe they took, came people. The question of when humans first arrived in the Americas is one of the most contested, most frequently revised, and most politically charged questions in all of North American archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the standard answer was approximately 13,000 years ago, through a corridor between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, which opened up as the glaciers began to retreat. The people who supposedly came through this corridor were associated with a distinctive stone tool technology called the Clovis culture, named for the town in New Mexico, where their characteristic fluted projectile points were first identified. The Clovis first hypothesis was elegant and tidy. It explained the rapid spread of humans across the Americas. It explained the timing of the megafauna extinctions. It had strong archaeological support at sites across North America. For decades, it was the consensus view, and then the edges started to fray. Sites began to turn up that predated Clovis. Monteverde in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillahay starting in the 1970s, showed evidence of human occupation approximately 14,500 years ago, which was older than Clovis and at the wrong end of the continent for a Clovis first migration to explain. The site also showed evidence of a non-Clovis tool technology, a different set of techniques and materials suggesting that multiple waves or routes of migration might be involved. In Canada, a site called Bluefish Caves in the northern Yukon has produced evidence of human activity, cut marks on animal bones made by stone tools dating to approximately 24,000 years ago. If this date is correct, and it has been challenged and reanalyzed multiple times, it would mean that people were present in the Yukon before the last glacial maximum reached its peak, which would mean that some population of humans survived in ice-free refugia in northwestern Canada and Alaska through the worst of the glaciation, and then spread south when the ice retreated. This is not implausible. The Yukon and interior Alaska, as we discussed, were largely ice-free during the last glacial maximum. The area known as Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia to North America when sea levels were lower, was a substantial landmass. At its maximum extent during the period of lowest sea levels, Beringia was approximately 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south. Not a narrow bridge, but a wide, flat, cold plain, covered in the same mammoth steppe vegetation as the rest of the periglacial zone. People who were already adapted to hunting and living on the mammoth steppe in Siberia would have moved into Beringia without necessarily knowing they were crossing from one continent to another. It was just more of the same landscape in the same direction. The question is when, and the question is how many times, because the genetic evidence from modern indigenous populations in the Americas is increasingly suggesting that there was not one migration event, but multiple. The current best interpretation of the genetic data suggests at least two major founding populations entered the Americas from Asia, and possibly more. The timing and routes of these migrations are still being worked out. The route question is the one that brings us back to Canada. For the Clovis people, and whoever immediately preceded them, the most commonly discussed route is the ice-free corridor. As the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets began to retreat from their maximum extent, around 17 to 15,000 years ago, they separated. Where they had met in what is now central Alberta, they began to pull back. A corridor of ice-free land opened up between the Rockies and the main body of the Laurentide sheet, running roughly north-south through what is now eastern British Columbia and Alberta. This corridor would have been an extraordinarily hostile environment. It was cold. It was windswept. The ground was recently deglaciated, which means it was either bare rock or covered in thin glacial till with little soil development. The lakes along the corridor would have been cold, deep, and largely lifeless, because the plants and animals that colonize newly deglaciated terrain do so slowly, following predictable succession patterns. The ice-free corridor in its earliest phases was not a rich landscape. It was a barren one. Research in the last decade has used ancient DNA and pollen analysis from lake sediments along the proposed corridor route to try to determine when the corridor became biologically viable. When did enough plants grow to support herbivores? When did enough herbivores arrive to support carnivores? When was there enough food along the corridor for a group of human hunters to survive the journey? The current evidence suggests the corridor became viable, meaning it supported enough animal and plant life to theoretically sustain migrating humans, approximately 13,000 years ago, which is approximately the same time as the earliest Clovis sites in the interior of North America. So the corridor could have worked for the Clovis migration, but it cannot account for Monteverde, which predates it. It cannot account for other pre-Clovis sites that are accumulating in the archaeological record. So there must have been another route. And the candidate that has gained the most traction in recent decades is the coast, the Pacific coast of North America, including what is now the coast of British Columbia during the last glacial maximum, and the period just after it was a complicated landscape. In some areas, the Cordilleran ice sheet reached the sea, and the coastline was simply buried. But there is evidence that parts of the coast remained ice-free, particularly around some of the outer islands. Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia, appears to have had significant ice-free areas throughout much of the last glacial maximum. Genetic evidence from bear populations on these islands suggests they were refugia, places where life persisted through the worst of the glaciation and then spread outward from as the ice retreated. The coastal migration hypothesis, sometimes called the kelp highway hypothesis, proposes that people moved down the Pacific coast in small boats, following the kelp forests that line the edge of the Pacific from Japan across the Aleutian Islands and down the coast of North America. Kelp forests are among the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. They support enormous populations of fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and seabirds. A people who knew how to exploit the kelp forest could have moved along the coast quickly, subsisting on marine resources without needing to penetrate the ice-free corridor at all. The problem with finding evidence for this hypothesis is that the coastline the migrants would have traveled is now underwater. When sea levels were lowered during the last glacial maximum, the coast extended further out into what is now the ocean. The camps and middens where early coastal people would have lived are now under 30 to 90 meters of seawater. Underwater archaeology is possible, but difficult and expensive, and the organic remains that would clinch the case have had 10,000 years to decompose under the ocean. Nevertheless, the evidence for early coastal occupation is accumulating. On the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California, dating back 13,000 years, at sites on the Oregon coast, and in Canada at sites on Haida, Guay, and in coastal areas of British Columbia that show human occupation well back into the early post-glacial period. Whoever came first, and however they came, the world they arrived in was extraordinary. Imagine, if you can, being the first human being to look down from the mountains into the Bow Valley in what is now Alberta, perhaps 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers had retreated enough to open the landscape, but the peaks were still capped with ice that had been there since before your grandparents were born. The valley below would have been a braided river system, multiple channels of meltwater spreading across a wide, flat floor, the water gray and silty with glacial flour. On the slopes above the valley, the vegetation would have been transitional, a mix of tundra plants, colonizing the bare rock and till where the ice had been, with stands of spruce beginning to move in at lower elevations as the climate warmed. And on the valley floor, among the gray braided channels, you might have seen mammoths, or bison, or horses, or all three. There is a concept in geology called a nunatak. The word comes from Greenlandic Inuit, and it refers to a peak of rock that protrudes above the surface of a glacier, an island of exposed bedrock in a sea of ice. During the last glacial maximum, when the Laurentide ice sheet covered virtually all of Canada, there were nunataks. Not many, but they existed. High peaks in the mountains whose summits rose above the ice surface, exposed to the wind and the cold and the thin Arctic light. These peaks were the only solid ground in a vast ocean of ice, and they were not lifeless. This sounds like an extreme claim. Life on a mountain peak, surrounded by kilometers of ice in every direction, in a climate colder than anything that exists in Canada today. But the evidence is there. The genetic signatures of certain plant populations in Canada contain what are called glacial refugia patterns, distributions that can only be explained if some populations survived the last glacial maximum in small isolated pockets, rather than recolonizing from populations that had moved south of the ice. Nunataks would have provided those pockets, cold, exposed, inhospitable, but not sterile. Some of the best evidence for Nunatak refugia in Canada comes from the Queen Charlotte Islands, which we now call Haida, Guay. The genetic diversity of certain plant and insect species on those islands is higher than what would be expected if the island had been recolonized from mainland populations after the ice retreated. The implication is that life was there throughout the glaciation, that Haida Gwaii was, at least in part, a refugium where organisms survived, and then, as the ice retreated, spread back into newly available habitat. This matters for the story of the first people in Canada because a refugium that could support plants and insects and presumably the animals that ate them could potentially have supported people as well. People with boats and knowledge of the ocean could have maintained themselves on the outer coast of British Columbia through even the worst of the glaciation, exploiting the marine resources that the kelp forest would have provided, regardless of what the ice was doing on land. It is a hypothesis, it is not proven, but the genetic and botanical evidence from the islands themselves makes it more than speculation. Let us talk about what the unglaciated parts of Canada actually looked and felt like during the last glacial maximum, because it is not what most people imagine. The unglaciated Yukon during the height of the glaciation was cold. Obviously cold, colder than the Yukon today, but it was also dry. This is the crucial fact about the Mammoth Steppe that most people miss. It was not a frigid wasteland of deep snow. It was a cold, dry grassland more like the steppes of Central Asia than like anything we call tundra today. Precipitation was dramatically lower than today because the ice sheets blocked the moisture-carrying atmospheric circulation patterns that bring rain and snow to northern Canada. The interior of Yukon during the last glacial maximum received perhaps half the precipitation it receives today. That dryness had two important effects. First, it meant that the snowfall was thin enough that large herbivores could reach the grass beneath it throughout the winter. A deep snow cover, such as we associate with modern subarctic Canada, would have made it impossible for horses and mammoths to access their food sources. The thin snow of the dry Mammoth Steppe did not prevent grazing. It barely inconvenienced it. Second, the dryness meant that the permafrost was stable. Permafrost requires cold and it requires dryness. In the Yukon of the last glacial maximum, the permafrost was deep and permanent and uninterrupted, and it was precisely this permafrost that would preserve so many remarkable specimens of Ice Age life, waiting for the gold miners of the 20th and 21st centuries to expose them. The air of the Ice Age Yukon would have smelled different from anything you could experience there today. The dustiness of the loess, the fine glacial silt carried by the wind, would have been constant. Downwind from active meltwater streams and outwash plains, the air during summer would have been hazed with fine sediment, and that sediment would have settled on everything, on vegetation, on water surfaces, on the coats of animals. The predominant smell would have been grass and cold mineral dust, with the sharp smell of the glacial flour drifting in from the direction of the ice. In spring, when the meltwater was running and the ground was saturating, there would have been the smell of exposed silt and standing water, the smell of a landscape in flux. The sounds would have been dominated by the wind. On the open Mammoth Steppe, wind is inescapable. It is the constant background against which everything else occurs. The high-pitched whistle of wind across dry grass, the deeper moan of it crossing an ice surface, the creak and groan of glacial ice, an almost subterranean sound that carries for kilometers in cold, clear air. And over all of it, occasionally, the sound of the animals. A mammoth herd moving through tall grass sounds like a ship moving through water, a deep, rhythmic displacement of material, punctuated by the crack of broken branches and the subsonic rumbling of infrasound communication between individuals, a sound you would feel in your chest rather than hear with your ears. The horses of the Mammoth Steppe moved differently from mammoths. They were lighter, faster, more nervous. A horse herd on the open steppe would have been sensed at a distance by the drumming of hooves, a vibration carried through the ground before the sound reached you through the air. And bison, in the numbers that existed on the Ice Age plains, would have produced a sound that has no modern equivalent in North America. The thunder of a bison herd moving at speed is something that the plains peoples of the 19th century described in terms of awe, of reverence, of something that altered your sense of the world. In the Ice Age, those herds would have been larger. The darkness at night on the Ice Age steppe would have been profound. No light pollution, no distant cities. The only illumination beyond the stars would have been occasional aurora, which in those high latitudes would have been frequent and intense. The increased solar activity during geomagnetically active periods and the clear, dry, particulate, rich air of the periglacial zone would have produced auroral displays of extraordinary intensity. Green and red and white curtains of light rippling across the entire dome of the sky, reflecting off the ice surface to the south, so that the horizon in that direction would have glowed with a diffuse, pulsing light, even when the aurora was not directly overhead. The first people who walked into that landscape and sat by their fires under those skies were in a world of unimaginable richness and scale, a world that had existed in essentially the same form for tens of thousands of years, a world that was about to end, because the ice was retreating. It had been retreating, slowly, then faster, since approximately 19,000 years ago. And what the retreating ice left behind would be as extraordinary as the ice itself. The moment when an ice sheet begins to melt is not a clean, clear event. It is gradual, and it is deeply local. In some valleys, the glaciers retreated rapidly as warm air penetrated and meltwater pooled beneath the ice, lubricating its movement toward lower elevations. In other areas, particularly on plateaus and high ground away from valley systems, the ice could persist for thousands of years after surrounding valleys had become ice-free. The edges of the ice did not retreat like a curtain being pulled back. They fragmented, isolated, formed disconnected lobes and tongues and patches, left behind blocks of dead ice, buried under outwash sediment that would persist for centuries before finally melting. The landscape immediately beyond the retreating ice was raw. Exposed bedrock scraped clean, thick deposits of till, the unsorted mixture of clay and sand and gravel and boulders that the glacier had carried and deposited. Kettles and potholes where buried ice blocks had melted and the ground above had collapsed. Eskers, the sinuous ridges of sand and gravel deposited by meltwater streams that had flowed inside and beneath the glacier, left standing above the surrounding terrain like the spines of buried serpents, running for tens of kilometers across the newly exposed ground. And water, everywhere, water. The meltwater from the retreating Laurentide ice sheet had to go somewhere, and in many cases it could not go to the sea immediately, because the land in front of the glacier was still depressed from the weight of the ice, creating basins where meltwater accumulated. Or the glacier itself formed a dam, and meltwater pooled in valleys between the ice and the uplands. Or the normal drainage routes to the sea were blocked by remaining ice, and water backed up into vast interior lakes. The result was a series of proglacial lakes, lakes that existed immediately in front of and around the margins of the retreating glacier, of a size that has no equivalent in modern Canada. Some of these lakes were temporary, lasting only a few centuries or a few millennia before the ice retreated, enough to open a drainage route, and the lake emptied catastrophically. Others persisted for longer, and one of them, the largest and most remarkable, persisted long enough to shape an enormous portion of the Canadian landscape and to influence the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. That lake was Lake Agassiz, named for the 19th century naturalist Louis Agassiz, who was one of the key figures in establishing the scientific understanding of the Ice Age. Lake Agassiz was the largest lake that has ever existed in North American post-glacial history. At its maximum extent, roughly 11,000 years ago, Lake Agassiz covered approximately 1 million square kilometers. For context, that is larger than any lake that exists anywhere on Earth today. The Caspian Sea, the largest lake on the modern planet, covers approximately 370,000 square kilometers. Lake Agassiz, at its maximum, was nearly 3 times the size of the Caspian Sea. It covered what is now most of Manitoba, much of Saskatchewan, the northwestern corner of Ontario, and extended into the Dakotas and Minnesota. The floor of what is now Lake Winnipeg, Lake Manitoba, and Lake Winnipegosis were all part of Lake Agassiz. The perfectly flat, extraordinarily fertile, agricultural land of southern Manitoba, the Red River Valley, and the surrounding plains, is flat because it was the floor of Lake Agassiz. When the lake finally drained, it left behind deep deposits of fine lacustrine sediment, silt, and clay that settled out of the standing water over thousands of years, and that sediment is now the sum of the most productive farmland in Canada. But Lake Agassiz was not just agriculturally significant, it was climatically significant in a way that altered the trajectory of the entire northern hemisphere. Approximately 12,900 years ago, something changed. The global climate, which had been warming slowly and steadily since the last glacial maximum, underwent an abrupt and dramatic reversal. Within a period of decades, possibly even years, the temperature in Greenland dropped by approximately 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. The North Atlantic, which had been warming, cooled rapidly. The glaciers in the mountain ranges of Europe, which had been retreating, advanced again. The evidence for this event is preserved in ice cores, in ocean sediment cores, in pollen records from lake beds across the northern hemisphere. It is one of the most clearly documented and most dramatic climate events in the record of the past 20,000 years. It is called the Younger Dryas, named for a small white-flowered plant, Dryas octopetala, which is a cold-adapted tundra species whose pollen appears in European peat deposits from this period, indicating a sudden return of cold conditions. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,200 years, from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. And then, with nearly the same abruptness with which it began, it ended. The temperature in Greenland rose by approximately 10 degrees Celsius within a decade. The glaciers retreated again. The tundra retreated. The forests advanced. What caused the Younger Dryas? The most widely accepted hypothesis involves fresh water. Specifically, it involves Lake Agassiz. The mechanism works like this. The North Atlantic Ocean plays a crucial role in global climate through a circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is the technical term for what most people know as the Gulf Stream and its associated deep water circulation. Warm, salty water flows northward in the Atlantic, gives up its heat to the atmosphere over the North Atlantic, becomes cold and dense, sinks to the deep ocean, and returns southward as a cold, deep current. This circulation carries an enormous amount of heat from the tropics toward the poles, and it is one of the reasons that Western Europe is warmer than its latitude would otherwise suggest. It is also sensitive to fresh water. Adding large amounts of fresh water to the North Atlantic disrupts the circulation by diluting the salt concentration of the surface water, making it less dense, preventing it from sinking, and slowing the entire circulatory system. The hypothesis is that around 12,900 years ago, Lake Agassiz, which had been accumulating meltwater behind a barrier of ice, suddenly drained. The ice dam that had been holding it back failed, and an almost incomprehensible volume of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic, probably via the St. Lawrence Valley or the Hudson Bay region. This freshwater surge diluted the North Atlantic surface water, slowed the overturning circulation, reduced the heat transport to the north, and plunged the northern hemisphere into the younger Dryas cold snap. The volume of water involved in this proposed flood is staggering. Some estimates suggest that the flood that ended the first phase of Lake Agassiz and triggered the younger Dryas involved a volume of water larger than the modern Great Lakes combined, released over a period of months to years. The flood would have raised global sea levels by several meters within a geological instant. It would have altered coastlines. It would have killed vast areas of freshwater and marine habitat simultaneously. It would have been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dramatic hydrological events in human experience. And humans were there when it happened. The people who had moved into the newly deglaciated landscapes of Canada, who were hunting the mammoths and bison and horses on the periglacial plains, experienced the younger Dryas as a sudden, severe reversal of the warming they had known. The tundra expanded south again. The tree line retreated. The growing season shortened. The permafrost strengthened. The mammoths, which had been slowly contracting their range as the warming climate shifted their habitat, were pushed back again for another millennium. But the younger Dryas ended, and when it ended, the final melt began. The final retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet from Canada was not uniform, and it was not peaceful. In some areas, the ice retreated at rates of several kilometers per year. In others, it stagnated and remained in place for centuries. Glaciologists who study the retreat patterns of the Laurentide from the sedimentary record describe a process of frequent oscillations, advances, and retreats happening over decades and centuries within the overall trend of withdrawal. A generation of people living near the ice margin might have watched the glacier advance back toward them one year and retreat again the next, the ice breathing in and out, the margin alive, in a way that we associate today only with alpine glaciers in rapid retreat. The surface of a retreating glacier develops features that have no real analog in ordinary experience. As the ice melts from the top down, the debris it contains, the rocks and boulders and gravel it picked up and carried for thousands of years, concentrates at the surface in a layer of chaotic, unsorted rock called ablation till. This debris insulates the ice beneath it, slowing the melt, creating a landscape of ice-cored mounds and hummocks that can persist for centuries after the active, moving glacier has retreated. The outwash plain in front of the glacier would have been crossed by constantly changing meltwater streams, braided and shifting, carrying the glacial flour that colored all the water gray. The noise of this environment, the rushing water, the occasional crack and groan of settling ice, the constant wind, would have been extraordinary. As the ice retreated from the Canadian Shield, it exposed a landscape that had been scraped to bedrock. The Precambrian rock of the Shield is ancient, over 1 billion years old in places, and the glacier had removed most of the soil and loose material that had accumulated on it over the geological past. What was left was bare, polished, grooved rock, dotted with erratic boulders that the ice had carried from distant sources and dropped as it melted. Some of these erratics are enormous, boulders the size of houses sitting on flat bedrock in the middle of what is now northern Ontario or Quebec, with a geological origin 300 kilometers away. There is a famous erratic in central Alberta called Big Rock, the Okotoks erratic, which is a single quartzite boulder nearly 40 meters long, 9 meters high, and estimated to weigh approximately 16,000 tons. It was carried from its origin in the Jasper area to its current resting place by the Laurentide ice sheet, a journey of roughly 500 kilometers over tens of thousands of years. And then the ice melted around it, and there it sat, and there it still sits, on the prairie south of Calgary. The Cree people of the area have a story about Okotoks, the great rock, in which the rock was flung across the landscape by the trickster figure Napi, who was being chased by the rock after insulting it. It is a story that encodes geological truth in narrative form. The rock did move across an enormous distance, placed by a force vastly larger and more powerful than any ordinary geological process. The people who encountered this landscape and these erratics were not reading geology textbooks. They were making sense of a world that bore the marks of immense, incomprehensible events, and they did so by placing those events within a framework of story and relationship. The Great Lakes of Canada and the United States are perhaps the most visible and enduring consequence of the Ice Age in eastern Canada. Every single one of the Great Lakes occupies a basin that was carved, deepened, and shaped by the repeated passage of the Laurentide ice sheet over underlying rock of varying hardness. The basins existed as river valleys before the ice, but the ice deepened them dramatically. Lake Superior is over 400 meters deep in places. Lake Ontario, the smallest by surface area and the shallowest on average of the Great Lakes, still reaches over 240 meters in its eastern end. These are not natural surface depressions. They are the scoured-out remnants of drainage systems that were buried under 3 kilometers of ice and ground progressively deeper over multiple glacial cycles. The Great Lakes did not look like they do today immediately after the ice retreated. They went through a series of stages, each with different water levels, different connections to each other, and different drainage routes to the sea. The earliest post-glacial lakes were proglacial lakes, held in place by the ice to the north. As the ice retreated northward, the lakes grew, then shrank as new drainage routes opened. The sequence of ancestral Great Lakes, with names like Lake Algonquin and Lake Iroquois and Lake Chicago, is documented in the shoreline terraces that are visible today in many parts of Ontario and the upper Midwest. Those terraces, the flat benches cut into hillsides at various elevations, are fossil shorelines, places where the waves of an ancient lake cut into the land before the lake level dropped and the water retreated. The connection between the Great Lakes and the sea was itself a subject of drama during the post-glacial period. For a time, as the ice retreated from the St. Lawrence Valley, the Atlantic Ocean pushed inland, and a cold, shallow sea flooded the St. Lawrence and Ottawa Valley lowlands. This body of water is called the Champlain Sea, and it existed for roughly 2,000 years, from approximately 13,000 to 11,000 years ago. The Champlain Sea was not a small pond. At its maximum extent, it covered a significant portion of what is now southern Ontario and Quebec, including the site of the modern city of Ottawa. The shoreline of the Champlain Sea ran through what is now the suburbs of Ottawa, Kingston, and Montreal. Marine animals lived in the Champlain Sea. The bones of bowhead whales, harp seals, walruses, and various species of Arctic fish have been found in the clay deposits that mark the former bed of the sea, in locations that are now well inland from the modern coast. A beluga whale skeleton was found in 1869 near Charlotte, Vermont, almost 1,000 kilometers from the modern ocean, buried in the clay of what was once the southern end of the Champlain Sea. The skeleton is still on display. The whale that lived where Burlington, Vermont is now had no way of knowing it was swimming in the temporary arm of a retreating sea, in a landscape that would become, in geological terms very soon, farming country. The clay deposited by the Champlain Sea is another of those Ice Age legacies that shapes Canadian life to this day. The Leda clay, also called quick clay or Champlain Sea clay, is the fine marine sediment that settled out of the Champlain Sea over its 2,000-year existence. It is extraordinarily fine-grained, and it has an unusual and dangerous property. When disturbed, particularly when saturated with water and subjected to sudden shock or vibration, quick clay can liquefy. It behaves suddenly like a liquid, losing its structural integrity and flowing in catastrophic landslides called spreads. The South Nation River landslide of 1910, the Lac Butte landslide of 1989, the Saint Jude landslide of 2010 that killed 4 members of a family in their home in Quebec when the ground beneath their house simply liquefied and slid into the Salveille River. All of these disasters occurred in Champlain's sea clay. The Ice Age left a beautiful agricultural landscape in the St. Lawrence lowlands, and buried under it a material that can, under the wrong conditions, revert to its original liquid state with almost no warning. We are now at a moment in the story that requires us to ask a difficult question, a question that has been argued over by scientists, philosophers, and indigenous knowledge holders for decades, and that does not have a comfortable answer. What happened to the mammoths? What happened to the horses, the camels, the giant ground sloths, the saber-toothed cats, the dire wolves, the short-faced bears, the American mastodons? What happened to the rich, complex, overwhelming megafauna of Ice Age Canada and North America? They are gone. All of them. Within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans in the Americas, most of the large mammals that had dominated the Ice Age ecosystems of North America were extinct. The timing varies by species and by region, and the details are contested, but the overall pattern is stark. At the last glacial maximum, North America had over 30 genera of large mammals, animals weighing more than 44 kilograms. By 10,000 years ago, roughly 3/4 of those genera were extinct, and the extinctions were concentrated in the same window of time as human arrival. The 2 hypotheses that have been most extensively argued are usually called overkill and climate change. The overkill hypothesis, first articulated in its modern form by paleontologist Paul Martin in the 1960s, proposes that human hunters were the primary cause of the megafauna extinctions. Martin argued that the megafauna of the Americas had evolved in the absence of human hunters, and that when people arrived, they were naive to the danger. They did not flee, or did not flee quickly enough, and people, armed with the projectile technology of the Clovis and pre-Clovis traditions, were extraordinarily effective hunters. Martin's blitzkrieg model proposed that a small initial human population could have spread across the Americas and driven the megafauna to extinction within a few centuries, moving in a wave from north to south, hunting each species to local extinction before moving on. The overkill hypothesis has the virtue of explaining several things at once. It explains why the extinctions are concentrated in the Americas and Australia, the 2 continents where megafauna persisted longest without human contact and then lost the most species when people arrived. It explains why the extinctions are not evenly distributed across geological time but are clustered at specific moments, coinciding with human arrival in specific regions, and it fits with what we know from historical record about the impact of human hunters on naive prey species. The extinction of the dodo, the great auk, the moa, and numerous other species by recently arrived human populations in island environments all follow a similar pattern. The climate hypothesis argues that the warming at the end of the last glacial maximum fundamentally altered the ecosystems that the megafauna depended on. The mammoth steppe, that cold, dry, productively grassy biome, was replaced by the warmer, moister, more forested biomes of the Holocene. The grass and sedge that fueled the megafauna was replaced by trees and shrubs. The habitat fragmented. The populations declined, and when the climate delivered the final blow of the Younger Dryas and then the rapid post-Younger Dryas warming, the megafauna, already stressed, could not adapt. The evidence for the climate hypothesis comes in part from the fossil record of earlier glacial cycles. The megafauna survived previous glaciations and the warm interglacials that separated them. They survived, presumably, climatic shifts comparable to or larger than the transition from the last glacial maximum to the Holocene. Why should this particular warming have been uniquely fatal? The current consensus, if it can be called that, in a field where every paper seems to generate three challenges, is that the answer is probably both. Climate change was happening, and it was stressing the megafauna populations. Human hunters arrived in that context, and they delivered the final pressure that pushed already stressed populations past the point of recovery. This is sometimes called the double jeopardy hypothesis or the synergy hypothesis. The mammoths did not need to be hunted to extinction individually. The hunters just needed to remove enough breeding individuals from already declining populations to push those populations into a spiral from which they could not recover. And there is something particularly poignant about that interpretation. The first people in North America were not necessarily slaughtering megafauna in vast quantities. They were surviving, hunting when they needed to eat, moving through a landscape that was already changing, already stressed. They could not have known because no knowledge system in the world at that time had experience with the collapse of an entire continental megafauna. They had no reference point for what was happening. They were just people living in a world, hunting what they could find, and the world was changing around them in ways that no individual person's lifetime could make visible. By around 8,000 years ago, most of the large Ice Age mammals of North America were gone. The woolly mammoth persisted in isolated populations in the Arctic, on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea, and most famously, on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia, where a dwarf population survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, outlasting the Egyptian pyramids by a few centuries. But on the mainland of Canada, the last mammoths were gone. The horses were gone, the camels were gone, the saber-toothed cats were gone. What remained was a different world, not less alive exactly, but differently alive. The forest moved north. The tundra shifted. The grasslands of the prairies established themselves as the permanent landscape of the interior. The gray wolf, which had been a subordinate predator in the Ice Age ecosystem, became the apex terrestrial predator of the Canadian wilderness, filling roles previously occupied by the American lion, the short-faced bear, the dire wolf. The grizzly bear, which had expanded its range as the forest grew, became a dominant presence across much of Canada. And the First Nations peoples who had lived through the end of the Ice Age adapted. They developed relationships with the landscapes that replaced the mammoth steppe. They became the intimate experts of a world that no longer contained the creatures their ancestors had hunted. Different peoples developed different relationships with different landscapes. The peoples of the prairie developed elaborate relationships with the plains bison, the animal that in some ways filled the ecological role of the mammoth on the grasslands. The peoples of the Pacific coast developed sophisticated marine technologies and relationships with the fish, marine mammals, and intertidal resources of a coastline that had risen as the ice retreated and the land rebounded. The peoples of the boreal forest developed relationships with the caribou, the moose, the beaver, the complex ecology of the forest and the lake. These relationships were not static. They were dynamic, adaptive, and continuously evolving over the 8,000 to 10,000 years between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of Europeans. But they were built on a foundation laid by the Ice Age, by the landscapes the ice created and the routes the first people took to enter them. Let us stop for a moment and think about what it means to have lived through what those first Canadians lived through. We know from the genetic and archaeological record that the first people in North America passed through a population bottleneck. The founding population of the Americas was small, Estimates vary, but the common genetic evidence suggests that the Americas may have been colonized by a founding group of perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, who then expanded dramatically across two continents. Those few hundred people, or those few thousand, carried with them the entire cultural and genetic heritage of their original population from Asia. They carried their languages, their stories, their technologies, their relationships, their knowledge of the natural world, and they walked into a world that was unlike anything their ancestors had ever seen. Not just the Ice Age megafauna, though that was surely overwhelming, but the specific geography of North America, which differed from Asia in ways that would have been immediately apparent. The mountains, the rivers, the seasonal patterns, the species of plants available for food and medicine. Everything was familiar enough to be recognizable because the basic ecology of the periglacial zone was continuous across Beringia, but different enough to require constant learning and adaptation. The knowledge those first people developed, the understanding of where to find water and food and shelter, the understanding of which plants were edible and which were toxic, the understanding of how the animals behaved and where they moved, this knowledge was built from nothing. From observation, from trial and error, from generational accumulation, over thousands of years, and it was eventually encoded in stories and ceremonies and practical knowledge systems that were passed from generation to generation. Some of that knowledge survives. Some of it is preserved in the oral traditions of the First Nations. Some of it is being recovered through the patient, collaborative work of archaeologists and indigenous communities working together. But much of it was lost in the catastrophic disruptions of the colonial period. The knowledge systems of the people who lived through the end of the Ice Age, who watched the mammoths go, who witnessed the formation of the Great Lakes, who stood on the shores of the Champlain Sea, that knowledge is largely gone. It is one of the great losses in human intellectual history. There is a place in Alberta that holds a particular significance in the story of Ice Age Canada. It is called Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, and it is located at the edge of the Porcupine Hills, where the foothills of the Rockies give way to the prairie, about 18 kilometers west of the town of Fort Macleod. The site consists of a sandstone cliff approximately 10 meters high, below which archaeologists have excavated a bone bed that stretches 11 meters deep into the ground, accumulated over nearly 6,000 years of use. For nearly 6 millennia, the Blackfoot people and their ancestors drove bison herds over that cliff. The technique required an intimate understanding of bison behavior, of the wind patterns on the prairie, of the topography of the land, of the psychology of the herd. Runners, called buffalo runners, would fan out across the prairie and gently, carefully, guide the herd toward a funnel of stone cairns and brush that narrowed toward the cliff edge. As the herd moved, other runners would begin to make noise, and the bison at the back of the herd would push the ones at the front. The herd, moving as a single panicked organism, would reach the cliff and go over. Hundreds of animals at a time. The people below would butcher the fallen bison and preserve the meat for winter. Every part of the animal was used. The bones were cracked for marrow and boiled for grease. The hides were tanned for clothing and shelter. The sinew was used for bowstrings and thread. The bladders and stomachs were used as water containers. The horns and hooves and tail were used for tools and ceremony. The dung was dried and used for fuel. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be wasted. Head smashed in is often described primarily in terms of the historical period, the last few thousand years. But the bone bed extends down through layers that are older than the jump's documented use, into an early post-glacial period, when the landscape looked different from today and the climate was still adjusting to the end of the ice. The connection to the Ice Age is not merely temporal, It is ecological. The buffalo jump is a response to the same landscape conditions that the Ice Age created. The grasslands of the Alberta foothills, the topography of the river valleys and coulees, the behavior of the bison herds, all of these are consequences of the Ice Age, of the landscape that the glaciers carved and the climate they helped establish. The Ice Age did not end cleanly. That is something that is easy to miss if you think of it as a distinct period with a clear before and after. The Ice Age did not end at a particular moment and give way to the modern world. It shaded into the Holocene, the current geological epoch, through a transition that took thousands of years and left its mark on every landscape in Canada. The geological, ecological, and even cultural legacies of the ice are still present, still shaping the country. Consider Hudson Bay, the great inland sea at the center of Canada, that enormous brackish body of water covering over 1 million square kilometers, is a direct consequence of the Ice Age. The Hudson Bay lowlands were depressed by the weight of the Laurentide ice sheet, and they are still rebounding. The land around Hudson Bay is rising, as we noted earlier, at approximately 1 centimeter per year. In 10,000 years, if nothing else changes, the rebound will have raised the land sufficiently that Hudson Bay will be significantly smaller than it is today. In 50,000 years, it may be largely dry land. The rebound itself, this ongoing rising of land in Canada, is called isostatic rebound or glacial isostasy, and it has measurable effects on sea level, on drainage patterns, and on the geography of the Hudson Bay coastline. Marshes and mudflats that were tidal a generation ago are now above the tide line. Coastlines that were accessible to ships a century ago are now too shallow. The land is still moving, still recovering, still remembering. The rivers of Canada remember the Ice Age too. The Mackenzie River system, which drains a vast portion of northwestern Canada into the Arctic Ocean, follows pathways that were established and shaped by glacial meltwater drainage. The Saskatchewan River, which flows across the prairies from the mountains to Lake Winnipeg, occupies a valley carved in part by glacial meltwater streams far larger than the modern river. The Ottawa River Valley, which forms the border between Ontario and Quebec, is in part a glacially carved feature, widened and deepened by the ice, and then partially filled by the sediments of the Champlain Sea. The soil of the Canadian prairies is a gift from the ice. The deep black Chernozem soils of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, some of the most fertile agricultural soils in the world, are the accumulated result of thousands of years of grass growth on top of glacially deposited loess and till. The prairie soils did not exist before the ice. The material they are built from was ground from bedrock by the glacier, transported by wind and water, and then biologically transformed by the slow accumulation of organic matter. From grass roots over 8,000 years of grassland ecology. The food produced on those soils today, the wheat and canola and lentils that feed people across the world, is the distant product of the Laurentide ice sheet. Let us now talk about the specific parts of Canada, region by region, and think about what each place looked like at the height of the Ice Age and just after it. British Columbia, the coast. During the last glacial maximum, most of the coast of British Columbia was either covered by ice or profoundly affected by it. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the interior plateau, the coast mountains, and in places extended to the sea. But certain areas of the outer coast, particularly the exposed islands and headlands of the outer archipelago, appear to have remained ice-free. Haida Gwaii, as we discussed, parts of Vancouver Island, the exposed headlands of the outer coast, where the fierce Pacific storms prevented the accumulation of ice, even in the coldest periods. These coastal refugia would have been austere places, cold, exposed to the full force of the North Pacific, with a climate dominated by ocean wind and salt spray. but they would have been biologically rich in the intertidal zone. The intertidal resources of the Pacific coast, the mussels, barnacles, sea urchins, chitons, abalone, intertidal fish, are extraordinarily productive and available year-round to people with the knowledge and technology to harvest them. A person who knew the tidal rhythms and the ecology of the intertidal zone could feed themselves from a stretch of rocky shoreline without any other food source. As the ice retreated from the coast, starting roughly 17,000 years ago, the coastline became progressively more accessible. Sea levels during the retreat were complex. The reduction in the weight of the ice allowed the land to rise, which tended to raise the coastline. But the meltwater pouring into the ocean was raising sea levels globally. The net effect varied by location, and the ancient coastline of British Columbia during the period of maximum human interest, the period when the first people were moving down the coast, was different from today's coastline in ways that archaeologists are still trying to reconstruct. What we know is that by approximately 13,000 years ago, the coast of British Columbia was largely ice-free. The kelp forests were reestablishing. The salmon runs were beginning to return to the rivers as temperatures warmed and the rivers cleared of glacial sediment, and people were there. The evidence is sparse, partly because many of the earliest sites are underwater, but it is accumulating. The interior of British Columbia was a different story. The interior plateau, the high, relatively flat land between the coast mountains and the Rocky Mountains, was covered by the Cordilleran ice sheet to a considerable depth. When the ice retreated from the interior plateau, it left behind a landscape of glacial lakes, erratic boulders, and bare till that would have been striking in its emptiness. The Thompson and Fraser rivers, which now define the geography of the interior plateau, re-established themselves gradually as the ice retreated, cutting down through the glacial sediment in valleys that had been filled and then overflowed by pro-glacial lakes. The Thompson River Canyon, that spectacular gorge through which the Trans-Canada Highway now winds west of Kamloops, was carved and shaped by this post-glacial process, by water and rock and time. The forests that now cover the interior plateau moved in slowly from refugia to the south and east, following the retreating ice north and west. Different species colonized at different rates. The lodgepole pine, which is a pioneer species capable of establishing itself on bare mineral soil, was among the earliest to arrive. The Douglas fir and the western red cedar followed more slowly, requiring more developed soil and a slightly warmer, more stable climate. The forests of interior British Columbia are in that sense still in the process of the post-glacial transition, still filling in the landscape that the ice vacated. Alberta, the prairies. If you could stand on the prairie just east of Calgary today and somehow see the land as it was 15,000 years ago, the most striking thing would not be the ice, because the ice would be behind you to the north and east. The most striking thing would be the color of the ground, not the gold and green of modern prairie grass, but something more gray, more subdued, more mineral. The loess that the wind carried off the outwash plain of the retreating glacier would have dusted everything. The vegetation would have been a cold steppe, dominated by drought-tolerant grasses and sedges, with cushion plants and artemisia, the sagebrushes filling the drier exposures, and somewhere in that landscape, almost certainly visible from the right vantage point, there would have been bison, not in the astronomical numbers of the mid-19th century, which were themselves a product of specific historical conditions, but in substantial herds, moving through the grass, following the seasonal patterns of available vegetation. The Alberta prairie, during the early post-glacial period, was also home to remnant populations of horses and perhaps camels in the southern and western portions of the province. The latest dates for horse remains in Alberta cluster around 11 to 12,000 years ago, at roughly the same time as the earliest documented human occupation of the region. The coincidence of timing is part of what makes the overkill debate so persistently difficult to resolve. The glacially scoured uplands of the Cypress Hills in southeastern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan present a particularly interesting case. The Cypress Hills are a plateau of sedimentary rock that rises above the surrounding plain, and there is evidence that they may have been partially or wholly above the surface of the Laurentide ice sheet during the last glacial maximum, a nunatak above the ice. The biological communities of the Cypress Hills contain some species whose distribution patterns suggest they survived the glaciation there, in situ, rather than recolonizing from the south. The hills have a disproportionately high biodiversity for their size and location, a signature that ecologists associate with long-term ecological continuity rather than post-glacial recolonization. Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The flatlands. The great flat interior of the prairie provinces is, as we have discussed, primarily the floor of Lake Agassiz. But the story of that landscape during the Ice Age is more complex than simply being underwater. The Lake Agassiz basin went through many phases. In its early phase, when the glacier was still retreating northward and blocking the normal drainage, the lake was relatively small and drained through the Minnesota River Valley into the Mississippi. As the ice retreated further north, new outlets opened, and the lake changed shape, expanded, contracted, and eventually, approximately 8,000 years ago, drained finally through Hudson Bay as the retreating ice opened that route. During the Lake Agassiz phase, which lasted roughly 4,000 years, the shores of the lake would have been active, dynamic environments. The lake was subject to storms that, given its enormous size, could generate substantial waves. The shoreline was dotted with beaches and spits of sand and gravel, and archaeological evidence suggests that people were living on those shores, fishing and hunting the waterfowl and large mammals that gathered at the water's edge. The final drainage of Lake Agassiz is estimated to have raised global sea levels by approximately 1 to 3 meters over a geologically short period. The water that had been accumulating in the Lake Agassiz basin for 4,000 years poured north through the newly opened Hudson Bay outlet in what must have been one of the most dramatic water flow events in post-glacial North American history. The Hudson Bay lowlands were flooded. Marine water pushed back up the newly cleared channel, and the flat floor of Lake Agassiz was left exposed, covered in deep clay, to become the farmland of Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, the Shield, and the St. Lawrence. The Canadian Shield of Ontario and Quebec is perhaps the most visible geological expression of what the Ice Age did to the land. 2 billion years of geological history compressed into some of the oldest exposed bedrock on Earth, and then scraped, polished, grooved, and studded with lakes by the repeated passage of ice. The lakes of the Shield, the tens of thousands of them that dot the surface of Ontario and Quebec, are not ancient features of the landscape. They are young. Most of them did not exist before the last glaciation. They occupy hollows and depressions scraped out by the ice, in bedrock that was exposed when the ice retreated. The Algonquin and Iroquois peoples, and the many other nations who made the Shield their home, built their entire ways of life around this landscape of interconnected lakes and rivers that the ice had created. The canoe routes of the Shield, the travel networks that connected communities across an enormous and otherwise nearly impenetrable landscape of rock and forest and water, followed channels that the ice had established. The portages that linked lake to lake, some of them worn smooth by centuries of use, crossed the ridges of rock that divided one glacially scoured basin from the next. The specific ecology of the Shield, the boreal forest that now covers it, is a relatively recent development in geological terms. The boreal forest moved north behind the retreating ice, following a warming climate, and it reached its present distribution only within the last 8 to 10,000 years. Before the forest, there was tundra, shrubby, and low. Before the tundra, there was the raw bedrock emerging from the ice. The forest of the Shield is, in that sense, an adolescent ecosystem, still maturing, still developing. The spruce and fir and birch that cover it are pioneers in a landscape that is still, on the geological scale, young. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. The Maritime Provinces. The Maritime Provinces were entirely covered by ice during the last glacial maximum. The ice extended well out onto what is now the continental shelf, which was above sea level during the glaciation because so much water was locked in ice globally. The coastline of the Maritimes during the last glacial maximum was not where it is today. It was much further out into what is now the ocean. The continental shelf of Atlantic Canada is shallow, rarely more than 200 meters deep, and during the height of the glaciation, when global sea levels were perhaps 120 to 130 meters lower than today, the shelf was exposed as dry land, an extension of the coastal plain that connected the present maritime shoreline to the edge of the continental shelf, where the seabed dropped away into the deep ocean. The exposed shelf would have been periglacial tundra in the early stages and gradually colonized by forest as the climate warmed. But the meltwater rise in sea level was relatively rapid in the early post-glacial period, and the shelf was progressively inundated as the ice melted. By approximately 8,000 years ago, the coastline of the Maritimes was roughly similar to today, though local variations in rebound and sea level continued to adjust the specific shoreline for thousands of years afterward. Newfoundland presents a particularly interesting case. The island, after the ice retreated, was initially devoid of most large mammals. The recolonization of Newfoundland by terrestrial animals was limited by the water barrier of the Strait of Belle Isle, which opened between the island and Labrador as sea levels rose. Animals that colonized the island in the post-glacial period had to cross water, and this limited the diversity of the mammalian fauna. The woodland caribou, which is the dominant large mammal of Newfoundland today, colonized the island by crossing ice bridges or swimming across the strait during periods when the crossing was narrow. The black bear is the only bear species on Newfoundland, because the grizzly bear, which occurred in mainland eastern Canada during the early post-glacial period, never managed to cross to the island. The Mi'kmaq people, who occupied the Maritimes and are among the original inhabitants of the region, have oral traditions that describe the movement of people across the landscape in the post-glacial period. Some of these traditions speak of a time when the land was different, when the coastline extended further, when the world looked unlike anything visible today. These traditions are not direct transcriptions of Ice Age events. They have been told and retold over thousands of years, and they carry the interpretive frameworks of their culture and time. But they gesture toward a deep relationship with a landscape that was continuously changing, and a people who adapted to that change over generations. The Arctic, the North. We have talked about the mammoth steppe of the Yukon, but the broader Arctic of Canada during the Ice Age deserves its own treatment, because it was neither ice-free nor a simple extension of the glacier. It was a patchwork, a complex mosaic of ice and tundra and exposed land that shifted with the decades and centuries as the climate fluctuated. The high Arctic islands of what is now Nunavut, the Queen Elizabeth Islands, Ellesmere Island, Devon Island, were largely covered by the Inuitian ice sheet, a separate glacial system that developed on the high plateaus of the Arctic islands and remained distinct from the Laurentide to the south. The Inuitian ice sheet was smaller than the Laurentide, and it left differently shaped features on the landscape, reflecting the different topography of the islands on which it formed. The area of what is now the Kivalliq region, the central mainland of what is now Nunavut, west of Hudson Bay, was covered by the western portion of the Laurentide ice sheet. The Fox Basin, the shallow sea between Baffin Island and the Melville Peninsula, was dry land during the last glacial maximum, covered by ice. Baffin Island was extensively glaciated, and portions of it remain glaciated today, though the existing Baffin Island ice caps are the shrunken remnants of a much more extensive ice system. The caribou of the Arctic did not, of course, wait for the ice to retreat before establishing their presence in the landscape. As the ice margin retreated northward across what is now the tundra, the caribou followed it. They were, and remain, an organism of the edge, of the transition zone between tundra and boreal forest, thriving in the expansive, windy, lichen landscapes that the retreating ice left behind. The ancestors of the Thule people, who developed in Alaska approximately 1,000 years ago and spread across the Canadian Arctic, found a landscape rich with caribou and ringed seals and bowhead whales, a landscape that the end of the Ice Age had made available, but that was itself a product of Ice Age conditions. The Paleo-Eskimo peoples who preceded the Thule in the Canadian Arctic, the Arctic small tool tradition people, and their descendants, the Dorset culture, occupied the high Arctic and the maritime zones of the Arctic coast for over 4,000 years before the Thule arrived. These were the people who lived at the edge of the world that the Ice Age had created, exploiting the extraordinary marine and terrestrial richness of the Arctic in the post-glacial period. The Dorset are the people who, in some interpretations, appear in Inuit oral tradition as the Tunnet, a people of great physical strength who lived before the Inuit and who made the large meat caches and boulder arrangements that Inuit hunters sometimes encountered in the landscape. The disappearance of the Dorset, roughly 1,000 years ago, around the same time the Thule expanded across the Arctic, is another of those events that has no clean explanation. Climate change played a role. The medieval warm period, which reached the Arctic around 1,000 years ago, may have altered the distribution of sea ice in ways that affected the Dorset's marine hunting practices. The expansion of the Thule, with their technologically superior cold weather adaptations including dog sleds, large skin boats, and toggling harpoon heads, may have outcompeted the Dorset for resources. The interaction between the two groups, whether peaceful, hostile, or some complex mixture, is not clearly preserved in the archaeological record. But the fact that the Arctic was inhabited at all, that people made their lives in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, and did so successfully for thousands of years, speaks to the extraordinary adaptability that the Ice Age demanded of the human species. The Ice Age was not just a geological event that happened to landscapes. It was a pressure that shaped cultures, technologies, and ways of knowing. The adaptations that allowed people to survive in periglacial Canada, in the tundra and the boreal forest and the frozen coast of the Arctic were accumulated over thousands of years of trial and adaptation. They were, in the most literal sense, the product of living in a world made by ice. Now let us talk about what remains, what you can see today that connects the present world to the world we have been describing. The erratics are the most obvious, those lonely boulders sitting in fields and on hillsides across Canada, too large to have been moved by anything ordinary, sitting on rock of completely different type and origin. In Ontario, there are boulders of Precambrian granite sitting on limestone plains, carried from the shield by the glacier and dropped on the sedimentary rock of the lowlands as the ice melted. In Saskatchewan, there are boulders of Archean metamorphic rock in the middle of agricultural fields, moved hundreds of kilometers by ice that covered the province to a depth of a kilometer or more. The eskers, those sinuous ridges of sand and gravel that run for tens of kilometers across the landscapes of northern Canada, they are the casts of rivers that once flowed inside the glacier on its floor, depositing their sediment load as they went. When the ice melted, the sediment ridges remained, elevated above the surrounding terrain, because the outwash plain that the meltwater had spread dropped lower as the water table receded. Eskers are among the most distinctive features of the Canadian Shield, and they have enormous practical importance because they provide the only well-drained, elevated ground in a landscape that is otherwise flat and wet. Traditional travel routes in the Shield followed eskers. Wildlife concentrates on eskers. The mining roads that cross northern Canada often follow eskers because they provide stable, naturally elevated ground in a landscape of muskeg and lake. The drumlins, the smooth teardrop-shaped hills that are scattered across southern Ontario, and the prairies in the Maritimes, always oriented in the direction the glacier was moving, streamlined by the ice into their characteristic asymmetric form. A drumlin field from the air looks like the bed of a river that has been frozen in place, the hills arranged like sediment ripples, all pointing in the same direction, all recording the direction of glacial flow at the moment they were formed. The drumlins of Nova Scotia are particularly striking, both in number and in their landscape expression. They form an agricultural landscape of extraordinary visual character, the hills providing elevated, well-drained farmland, separated by the wet, low-lying areas between them. The polished rock. Across the Canadian Shield, exposed bedrock surfaces often display the characteristic polish and striations of glacial abrasion. The polish is caused by fine-grained rock, flour caught between the moving glacier and the bedrock surface below, acting as a medium grit. Sandpaper applied with the pressure of a kilometer of ice. The striations are caused by larger rocks embedded in the glacier's soul, plowing furrows across the bedrock like fingernails drawn across soft wood. The striations record the direction of ice movement at the moment they were formed, and they can be read by geologists to reconstruct the flow patterns of the Laurentide ice sheet in extraordinary detail. And the lakes, above all, the lakes. Canada contains approximately 2 million lakes. This is not a number that can be absorbed easily, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment. 2 million. More than any other country on Earth. More than all of Europe combined. Canada contains approximately 9% of the world's fresh water. The reason for this extraordinary abundance of lakes is almost entirely the Ice Age. The Laurentide ice sheet scraped and scoured and carved and overdeepened. It deposited moraines that dammed drainage and created new basins. It left behind buried ice that melted into kettle lakes. It pressed the land down so that drainage was disrupted and water pooled in new configurations. The lake landscape of Canada is the Ice Age landscape of Canada. Every canoe trip, every cottage vacation, every summer swim, every loon call across the water in the early morning is a consequence of the Laurentide ice sheet. There is one more animal that deserves its own section in this story, an animal that is not as dramatic as the mammoth, not as charismatic as the saber-toothed cat, not as enormous as the short-faced bear, but in terms of its impact on the Ice Age landscape of Canada and on the people who came after the ice, this animal may be the most important of all. The animal is the beaver. Not the modern beaver, Castor canadensis, or rather, not just the modern beaver, the Ice Age beaver. During the Pleistocene, Canada was home to a species called the giant beaver, Castoroides ohioensis. It was the largest rodent that has ever lived in North America, approximately the size of a modern black bear. A giant beaver could weigh over 100 kilograms and reach over 2.5 meters in length. It was not a simple scaled-up version of the modern beaver, anatomically speaking. Its skull was proportionally different. Its teeth were structured differently. Its lifestyle may have been less industriously engineering than the modern beavers. The giant beaver may not have built dams in the same way or at all. The fossil record suggests it preferred marshy, slow-moving environments rather than the stream habitats where modern beavers typically build. But the giant beaver was present in significant numbers across much of Canada east of the Rockies during the late Pleistocene. Its bones have been found in Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Alberta, and across the prairies. It was contemporary with the first people in the region, and it was gone by approximately 10,000 years ago, part of the same megafauna extinction wave that took the mammoths and horses. The modern beaver, its smaller cousin, survived, and the modern beaver's impact on the post-glacial Canadian landscape was, in its quiet way, as significant as the glacier's own. Beavers build dams, dams create ponds, ponds accumulate sediment. When beavers abandon a pond and the dam eventually fails, the sediment remains, a flat, fertile beaver meadow in a landscape of rock and forest. Over thousands of years, the cumulative effect of beaver activity across the Canadian Shield and the boreal forest has been to create millions of small wetlands, to regulate water flow in river systems, and to produce a mosaic of habitats far more diverse than a continuous forest would have supported. The beaver shaped post-glacial Canada in collaboration with the ice. The ice created the lake basins and the river channels. The beaver managed the hydrology of those channels, creating the complex wetland networks that define the boreal forest landscape. And then, when Europeans arrived and nearly drove the beaver to extinction through the fur trade, they inadvertently began to unmake the post-glacial beaver landscape, draining the ponds and simplifying the hydrology that the beaver had maintained. The fur trade itself, which drove the initial European exploration and colonization of Canada, was a consequence of the Ice Age in a roundabout way. The beaver survived the Ice Age. The beaver thrived in the post-glacial landscape. The boreal forest landscape that the retreating glacier created was perfect beaver habitat, and beavers multiplied enormously across Canada in the thousands of years following the ice. The extraordinarily abundant beaver population that European trappers encountered in the 17th and 18th centuries was the product of 10,000 years of post-glacial expansion. The wealth that the fur trade extracted from Canada, the wealth that funded exploration and established permanent European settlements, was essentially a harvest of the Ice Age's biological legacy. This is the kind of connection that becomes visible when you look at Canadian history through the lens of deep time. The fur trade looks like a story about European demand for fashionable hats and indigenous peoples' knowledge of trapping and travel routes. And it is that. But it is also a story about the Ice Age, about a glacier that created a landscape and a small furry mammal that thrived in that landscape for 10,000 years, and Europeans who arrived and found that abundance and extracted it. Everything is connected to everything else, and the Ice Age is the connective thread beneath all of it. Let us talk about what the research is currently doing, where the science of Ice Age Canada stands right now, and what questions are still open. Ancient DNA has transformed the study of Ice Age megafauna in the last 2 decades. The ability to extract and sequence genetic material from frozen specimens, from bones preserved in permafrost, from teeth in caves, has opened a window into the biology of Ice Age animals that the fossil record alone could never provide. We now know the genetic relationships between woolly mammoths and modern elephants in extraordinary detail. We know that mammoths hybridized occasionally with the Columbian mammoth, a related species that lived further south in more temperate environments. We know the approximate size of mammoth populations over time, tracking their decline through the genetic signature of reduced diversity as numbers fell. We know the color of at least some individual mammoths because the genes for coat color are preserved in some specimens and can be analyzed. We also know from ancient DNA that horses did not simply disappear from North America. Their DNA persists in the modern horses of the Americas, the descendants of the European horses brought back by Spanish explorers in the 16th century. When those horses were released or escaped into the wild and formed the Mustang populations of the American West and the Plains, they were returning to a landscape that horses had occupied for millions of years. The genetics of the modern feral horses of the Americas contain traces of the Ice Age horses of North America. The Mustang is not a foreign animal in the Americas. It is a native returning. The study of the first people in Canada has also been transformed by ancient DNA. The genetic analysis of ancient human remains, including from the Canadian Arctic, from burial sites in Ontario and British Columbia, and from remains found in other parts of the Americas, has substantially revised our understanding of the peopling of the Americas. The picture that is emerging is more complex than the simple Clovis first model, involving multiple migration events, population replacements, and interactions between different founding groups that we are only beginning to trace. One remarkable case from Canada involves the Kennewick Man, which, though found in Washington state, has implications for understanding the deep history of North American populations. But more directly, Canadian is the genetic analysis of remains from On Your Knees Cave on Prince of Wales Island in southeastern Alaska, which represents one of the oldest human remains from the northwestern coast, dating to approximately 9,300 years ago. The genetic profile of this individual is consistent with a coastal migration route, supporting the idea that at least some of the first people in northwestern North America and Canada arrived by sea rather than through the ice-free corridor. The land itself is still being read. LiDAR technology, which uses laser scanning from aircraft to create extremely detailed topographic maps, has revealed archaeological sites and landscape features invisible under the forest cover. Sites that would have taken decades to discover through conventional survey have been identified in days by LiDAR analysis of the post-glacial landscape. The same technology is being used to study the glacial landforms of northern Canada in unprecedented detail, revealing the flow patterns of the Laurentide ice sheet and the drainage patterns of the meltwater lakes, with a precision that was impossible a decade ago. Climate models are being run backward, using the physics of the climate system to reconstruct what the temperature, precipitation, and wind patterns of Ice Age Canada would have looked like. These models, when validated against the preserved physical and biological evidence, give us a way to feel what Ice Age Canada felt like, not just where the ice was, but how cold it was, how dry, how windy, how much the seasons differed from today, and the permafrost is still yielding its secrets. Every summer in the Yukon, gold miners wash away ancient gravel with high-pressure water hoses, and sometimes what the water exposes is more than gold: a mammoth tusk, a piece of ancient horsehide, a mummified ground squirrel, an Ice Age insect preserved so perfectly that it looks like it might rouse itself and fly away. The permafrost of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories is one of the richest archives of biological information from the Ice Age that exists anywhere on Earth. It is also, in a deeply unsettling way, an archive that is being threatened. The permafrost of the Yukon is thawing, not just where miners have disturbed it, but everywhere as the climate warms. Material that has been preserved for 30,000 years is being exposed to decomposition for the first time. The information it contains is being lost before it can be studied. There is a particular irony in this, and it is worth naming. The Ice Age is ending, not the Wisconsin glaciation, which ended 10,000 years ago, but the broader Pleistocene legacy of permafrost and cold, the inheritance of the ice. It is ending because the climate is warming, and the warming is driven by changes in atmospheric chemistry that are substantially caused by human activity. The same species whose arrival in North America may have contributed to the extinction of the Ice Age megafauna is now, through different mechanisms, dismantling the permafrost archive that preserves the record of those animals. The mammoth's frozen grave is thawing. Nunchoga's tomb is becoming unreliable. The 30,000-year-old record written in the permafrost of the Yukon is degrading at an accelerating rate. The urgency that scientists feel about studying Ice Age Canada is not only intellectual, it is a race against a loss that cannot be reversed. I want to take a moment here, if you're still with me, and simply ask you to think about scale, because I think the Ice Age suffers from a problem of abstraction. When we say 26,000 years ago, the number is so large that it becomes meaningless. When we say the ice was 3.5 kilometers thick, it is hard to locate that in any experience. When we say 1 million square kilometers of lake, there is nothing in ordinary life to compare it to. So let us try to make it more human. 26,000 years ago, there were people alive. Real people. People with languages and relationships and grief and laughter and children they loved. People who understood their world in sophisticated and detailed ways, who knew the behavior of animals and the ripening of plants and the coming of seasons, the same way you know the layout of your neighborhood and the habits of the people you live with. Those people were alive at the same moment that the ice was reaching its maximum extent over Canada, and from their perspective, there was no ice age. There was just the world. A cold world, a world of ice and steppe and enormous animals. But their world, the only world they had ever known, the world their parents had grown up in and their grandparents before them. The ice sheet that covered Canada was not an event to those people who lived at its margins. It was not a disaster or a catastrophe or a crisis in the way we might imagine it. It was simply the background condition of existence. The mammoths were there. The horses were there. The cold was there. This is what the world was, and had been this way, from their perspective, forever. The transition from the Ice Age to the Holocene was real and measurable, and it had profound consequences. But it unfolded over thousands of years, and the people who lived through it experienced it as gradual change, as the slow adjustment of landscape and climate across generations. No individual person alive during the deglaciation experienced the Ice Age and the modern world within their own lifetime. What they experienced was a world that was, year by year and decade by decade and century by century, slowly changing. Warmer, wetter, more forested, less grassland. Different animals in different numbers in different places. That kind of change, slow and continuous and embedded in the ordinary texture of daily life, is the kind that gets absorbed into culture rather than recorded as event. It becomes part of the landscape of story, the background against which other events take place. The lake that was once a grassland, the valley that was once under ice, the cliff that was once a shoreline. These things are remembered not as history in the sense of a datable event, but as geography, as landscape, as the place where things are the way they are. Some indigenous traditions in Canada contain what researchers believe may be encoded memories of post-glacial landscape changes. The Tsimshian people of the northwest coast have stories of a time when the sea was far away, when the present coastline was far inland from the shore. Researchers who have mapped the ancient coastline of northwestern British Columbia, reconstructing the sea level history of the region, find that the coastline, as described in some of these stories, corresponds to conditions that existed approximately 10,000 years ago. That is not a claim that the stories are literal records of 10,000-year-old events. It is a suggestion that the oral tradition has preserved, in some form, a memory of a profoundly different geographical world. That kind of temporal depth in oral tradition is, if it holds up to scrutiny, one of the most remarkable things in the entire human story. We are reaching the end of this particular journey through time. But before we close, I want to go back to where we started, to the rock shelves at Kelly's Cove near Georgian Bay with their long parallel grooves cut into the stone. Those grooves were made by ice that was, at the time of their making, roughly 15,000 years ago, still immensely thick and moving. The ice that made those grooves was moving southward, toward the edge of the Laurentide ice sheet, and as it moved, it carried rocks and gravel that ground across the bedrock like sandpaper, cutting those precise channels into the limestone and granite of the shield. When the ice retreated, it left those grooves exposed, and they have been exposed ever since. For 15,000 years, rain has fallen on them, and snow has covered them, and the sun has warmed them, and lichens have grown in their margins. 15,000 years ago, the people who would eventually become the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the other nations of the Great Lakes region had not yet arrived in this part of Canada. The forest that now surrounds Kelly's Cove had not yet grown here. There were no loons, because there were no lakes yet, or the lakes were too fresh and too cold and too recently created to support the fish that loons eat. There was almost nothing here that you would recognize. And now, 15,000 years later, you can press your hand against those grooves and feel what the ice did. The ice that was here, the ice that built this country. That is the extraordinary thing about geology, about deep time, about the Ice Age legacy of Canada. It is still here. It did not happen somewhere else, to someone else's landscape, in some other world. It happened here, under the soil of the prairies, under the lakes of Ontario, under the streets of Montreal, under the forests of British Columbia. The Ice Age is not over. It is still happening, still echoing, still shaping. The land is still rising. The permafrost is still thawing. The rivers are still carrying the legacy of glacial meltwater. The lakes are still occupying the basins the ice carved. Canada is a country built by ice. That is not a metaphor. It is the most literal description of Canadian geography that exists. The ice came, and it stayed for tens of thousands of years, and it reshaped everything, and then it went, and what it left behind is where we live. There were mammoths here. There were saber-toothed cats, and giant beavers, and horses, and camels and lions larger than any that exist today. There were people, the first people, who walked into this landscape with their languages and their technologies and their knowledge and their stories. There were floods of unimaginable scale and lakes the size of seas and a cold snap that briefly reversed the warming and then released it, and a final melt that took thousands of years and changed the planet's coastlines and altered the circulation of the oceans. All of that is beneath your feet if you are anywhere in Canada. The history is in the rock and the soil and the water and the shape of the land. You just have to know how to read it, and knowing how to read it changes how you see the country. The flat prairie is not just flat. It is the floor of an ancient lake. The rocky lake country of Ontario is not just beautiful. It is the scoured surface of an ice sheet's floor. The mountains of British Columbia are not just mountains. They are the edges of a landscape that the Cordilleran ice sheet reshaped and is still reshaping. The broad river valleys of the Maritimes are not just river valleys. They are the legacy of a landscape that has been covered and uncovered, pressed down and released, drowned by a cold sea, and then lifted back into light. If you could take a single step backward in time, 20,000 years, and stand on the land that is now Canada, you would stand on ice. Kilometers of it, under a sky of impossible brightness and cold, surrounded by silence except for the wind, and occasionally, if you were very lucky or very unlucky, the distant sound of something enormous moving through a landscape that is gone. That landscape is gone. The mammoths are gone. The horses are gone. The ice has gone, at least for now, in its great sweeping continental form. But the world it made is still here. It is the world you live in. It is the world Canada is. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely, this is the kind of content that takes a long time to research and to write, and knowing that someone is out there listening to the whole thing makes it worth it every time. If you are somewhere in Canada tonight, I hope this gave you a different way of looking at wherever you are. If you're somewhere else in the world entirely, I hope you got a sense of just how extraordinary this landscape is and how deep the history beneath it goes. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Was it the mammoth, the Great Lake, the first people walking into a world no human had ever seen? Tell me. I read every single one, and I always write back when I can. If this is your first time here, subscribe. This channel is built on exactly this kind of story. Long, slow, deep dives into the natural and human history of places that deserve more attention than they usually get. New videos come out regularly, and they are always free. Take care of yourself tonight. Sleep well. And if you dream, dream big. Dream of ice 4 kilometers thick, and mammoths in the grass, and the first human eyes to look out over a landscape that had been waiting in patient geological silence for exactly that moment. Good night.